Okay, so I wanted to start today by talking about the architecture of social meditation, the way that this practice and these practices are actually constructed. Because no matter which practice we end up doing or facilitating over the course of this training together, all of them are going to share in common the same meta structure, the same architecture, the same design. And the core of this design we think of in terms of phases, because these are things we move through sequentially each time we practice social meditation. And there are three phases to this practice. The first phase is the setup phase. That happens at the beginning. The second phase is the practice phase, which happens in the middle. And then the last phase is the debrief phase, which happens at the end. And this basic structure, as I said, is universal, so it applies to all practices. I'd say the first two phases you kind of have to do minimally. The debrief phase, where we're actually talking about the practice, that's can be modified depending on the situation. But to me, I consider it a core part of the practice. And so I just wanted to kind of break these three phases down a little bit and give you a sense of what to expect as we do the practice, and then also give you a sense of what to expect as you end up facilitating these techniques and practices. And so in the setup phase of the practice, we're going to always begin by sharing a little bit of background about the practice, any relevant background information. For me, I often will share something about the personal connection that I have with a particular practice. If it's one that I've designed, obviously I'll share a little bit about how it came about. If it's something that someone else designed and developed, then I'll reference them, I'll attribute them as the original creator of the technique. That's part of how we share these practices, because we share them with an open source license, meaning anyone can take this information and use it, and use it in their work even. And we ask that everyone in doing that attribute where the practices that they're sharing have come from. So that's the only stipulation really on the open source license, is that they're by attribution. So I'll always share where these things come from. And then in the setup phase also, we're sharing the instructions for the practice. What are you actually doing? What are the core instructions here? What's the instruction set? I'll also, in the setup phase, always try in some ways to demonstrate the practice, whether that is through my own personal out loud demonstration of the technique, and or inviting other people in the group to help me demonstrate what it's like for multiple people to do the practice in more of a social setting. And then in the setup phase, I also always will ask if there are any questions. Once I've given the instructions and demonstrated it, are there any questions? Does anyone still uncertain about any aspect of the technique or how to do the technique in particular? And if there are questions, I'll do my best to respond and help clarify the instructions. And once it seems like everyone is clear, then we'll do the practice and we'll enter into the practice phase. And it's interesting because depending on how the practice is set up and what the instructions are, that can look different ways. We might practice together, for instance, all in the same group. It might be like a larger group practice where all 10 or 12 of us are practicing together. Oftentimes it'll look like going into smaller groups of 3 to 4 people each, and then doing some practice. And sometimes there'll be a combination of that. We'll go into small groups for one part of the practice and then come back into a larger group for another phase of the practice. So there's a lot of different ways that practice could look based on or depending on the practice itself and the technique and what the facilitator is aiming for. But in any case, we'll actually do it. We'll actually engage in the practice. And there's not much more to say than that. I mean, that's it. But then after we're done, after the practice period's over, and we come back and we return from the experience, then it's almost as if returning from a journey or a trip. It's like, oh, how was that? How was the trip? How was the journey? What did you notice? What did you see along the way? What rare creatures did you observe, if there were any? Or what mundane pains did you encounter? What was it like practicing with other people? What questions came up? Were there confusions? Was there a way in which you felt like you or your group wasn't doing the technique properly and you were wondering about how to do it? All of those things are fair game from my point of view in the debrief round, which is really a kind of open discussion about the practice and how it went. It's a kind of, it's in a way, it's a reflective practice itself, a social practice itself, because we're reflecting on what just happened. And we're seeing kind of the significance of experience. I mean, how often, right, do we have experience as a meditator where we may have a session and then we get up off the cushion and we just go about our day? And it's almost like a dream that we remember upon waking that very quickly fades. And it's like, oh, well, what was that? I feel the lingering effects, but like, what was the significance? How do I make sense of my practice? That's part of the intention of the debrief round, is to collectively do some collective sense making around our practice, and draw out some of the insights that occur in that practice.